Rosie Chopra is from General Electric. She's a consultant for GE Capital Fleet Services Canada. Her focus is twofold. A portion of her responsibility lies in supporting the internal fleet conversion for electric for GE Canada, and she's also responsible for a go-to market strategy for a full turnkey solution for GE's customers. So prior to joining GE, Rosie was a consultant at KPMG LLP, where her focus was on clients in the real estate market, government, insurance, and finance sectors. Rosie completed her Master's of Accounting and Finance from the University of Waterloo and also holds a Chartered Accountant's designation. Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me here today. So I wanted to actually kick off this presentation by talking a little bit about GE's very big commitment. And so as some of you are probably well aware, back in November 2010, our chairman and CEO, Jeff Immelt, made a really big commitment for 25,000 electric vehicles by the year 2015, which is essentially the world's largest commitment for EVs. And so we hope to accomplish this goal in two ways. The first is through converting our own, or at least half of our internal fleet of 30,000 vehicles. So in other words, 15,000 vehicles are aimed to be electric by the year 2015. And the other way is through our fleet services business, where we lease and finance vehicles to large company fleets. And so the goal there is also to convert a portion of our customers' fleet. So essentially the main point here is that we are highly committed to the EV space as a company. And so this next slide here kind of answers the why. So why is GE playing in this space? And essentially it's mainly because we do operate on pretty much every aspect of the EV value chain, from renewable power generation to smart grid systems to even our GE Energy Services business that produces and manufactures GE charging stations, as we just saw. In addition, like I mentioned in the previous slide, we also have a fleet services business that focuses on leasing and financing vehicles to company fleets. We also have another business that's called Eco Imagination that focuses on eco-friendly products at low cost that's provided to consumers, and so EV falls into that realm as well. And so essentially GE does have the products, the expertise, and the solutions which can make us a global leader when it comes to EV. What I want to focus today on, though, is not what we can do, but what we've done so far with respect to converting our own internal fleet to electric. And so to date, we have 1,000 electric vehicles on road. This was a huge accomplishment, and it wasn't accomplished overnight. This took months and months of hard work from our fleet services team and our energy services team. A caveat here is that a large portion of these vehicles are in the U.S. The other regions haven't ramped up to the extent that we'd like them to as of yet, and we're still working on that. So a large part of this presentation will be based on the U.S. conversion. And so over here, this is a pretty nice visual of each of the components that we looked at when we were completing or going through our internal fleet conversion. This is a nice visual. It does show kind of like a step-by-step process, but by no means when we were going through our fleet conversion was it a step-by-step process. We were looking at each of these components systematically, and so I'm going to go through each of these and deep dive into them today, but the first being a VOE, or a voice of the employee. So prior to actually launching the EV program within our fleet, we got our employees' feedback to see what their general feedback was about about the program and whether they would enjoy an EV as a company car. The second thing that we did was a driver survey. So we sent out a driver survey to the large group of drivers within our American internal fleet, just to determine which ones were best suited to take on an EV. And then based on that survey and the responses, we were able to recommend the rock star, so to speak, drivers. That would be our first round of EV drivers. After that, we've been focusing a lot on tracking information from our drivers and the fleet and training our drivers on not only the EVs but the EVSE. And then the final step, though I think this might have gone before tracking and training, was ordering and install. So ordering the EVs itself and then ordering the EVSE and sourcing an installation provider. So just kicking it off with the voice of the employee. So essentially, we picked at random 20 employees across 5 different GE businesses, all fleet drivers, and got them into one room at corporate headquarters. The main intent was just to gain feedback on our EV offering and to figure out whether they would actually enjoy an EV as a company car. And so the findings were absolutely tremendous. We found that 100% of employees would drive an EV. We found that 83% of employees would sport an EV with the GE logo attached to it. So we're currently in the process of tracking down the 17% that answered no to that. 100% of employees indicated that the EV offering is a positive initiative for the company. And really, when we deep dive into the main benefits that the employees sought from the program, a lot of it was along the lines of thought leadership, PR and branding, the great aspect of the fact that our company was actually walking the talk. We're not just coming up with this big commitment, but we're actually actioning on it. A lot of employees said that the Chevy Volt specifically would be a great employee car because it is so tech savvy. And then the infrastructure build out, because we did commit to providing each and every one of them with level 2 charging stations that we would install in their homes, plus charging stations that would be rolled out at our campuses. In terms of the considerations or the pieces of feedback where we kind of needed a little bit more improvement or a bit more digging, a lot of it surrounded around employee education. And by this, employees were just hungry for information on what the program meant, what the intent was, why GE was operating the space so that they could be an ambassador on behalf of the company and talk to their customers about this. And so since getting that piece of feedback from them, we've been working very hard at developing a sort of an ambassador program for our employees. And so the next piece was, okay, let's send out a driver survey to the large group of fleet drivers in the U.S. fleet, so approximately 10,000 internal drivers, and find the best 100 rockstar drivers to first set this program off. And so we focused on 5 key criteria in the survey. The first was mileage, so can it get the driver there? At this point, we had already committed to the Chevy Volt, and so of course the Chevy Volt can get a driver there because it does obviously have the backup gasoline engine, but we wanted to focus on drivers that could utilize more of the electric range versus the gasoline range, and so that became an important element. Cargo, so will it fit my driver's tools and equipment and all that sort of stuff. A lot of our drivers, especially from our healthcare business and from our energy services business, do carry a ton of equipment and tools around with them, and so space became I wouldn't say an issue, but space became a big consideration when we were determining which drivers to first put into these vehicles. Routes, for the most part, we were focusing on sales fleet, as I mentioned. We had some executive drivers as well, and we had a few delivery vehicles that we were considering placing in the vehicles. From a charging perspective, this was actually a challenge that we came across. Like I mentioned, the intent of the program was to provide these drivers with level 2 charging stations to be installed in their home. The question that came up was, okay, do these drivers own their own home? Do they rent their own home? Do they live in a high-rise building? All of those things needed to be taken into account, and we had to be sensitive to what information drivers wanted to provide us with. When we were able to find our drivers that were our ideal candidates that actually own their own home and plus have a garage where we can install a level 2 charging station, one of the biggest findings that we had was that a lot of people don't park in their garage. They have a lot of stuff in their garage and they just don't park in it. And so that was more of a changing behavior habit on our end. With respect to location, when you think back to Q1 of last year, these vehicles were just in the midst of being rolled out and there wasn't a national rollout at this point. And so one of the things we had to be cognizant of was where the drivers were located relative to service maintenance dealerships. Okay. So essentially, once we got the survey responses back and we were able to pinpoint the best sort of rockstar drivers for the program, we went back to the fleet managers from the individual businesses and we said, okay, here's our recommendations on who we think should be put in an EV in terms of first round. And then came the ordering of the EVs and the ordering of the EVSEs. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, mainly because there wasn't a whole lot of challenges here. The biggest challenge itself was just sourcing a supplier, or I shouldn't say a supplier, sourcing an installation provider that had national presence across the U.S. To provide installation services for our drivers in their homes. And so that was the trickiest part. And then essentially, once we had that sort of down pat, GE is very, very good at developing very tightly integrated partnerships with companies and is very, very good at developing very robust processes to get things going. One challenge I will say, though, was with respect to the actual installation piece in the driver's home. There was a sensitivity surrounding that because we had never gone into a driver's home previously to install a piece of equipment. And so that was a sensitivity that we had to deal with. So we had to get our legal minds working, our operational minds working, our risk minds working. And it actually ended up being fairly straightforward once we got through the T's and C's of it all. And so, again, after going through the process of installing the charging stations in the driver's home, ordering the EVs, and providing the drivers with the EVs, we noticed that there was a hunger for learning, and we knew that, given that there's so many differences between an EV and a traditional ICE vehicle, that we had to provide this level of training to our drivers. And so we went through it through two methods. One was more of the conventional method, which was videos and communications. So essentially GM was phenomenal in providing us with some really great videos on the topic of the Volt and how to utilize the Volt and all that sort of great stuff. And then our GE Energy business was also great in providing us with some communications that we could send out to the drivers on how to utilize the charging stations. Also from the get-go of the program, we were frequently communicating the drivers, giving them the heads up on when they would be getting their vehicles, what this meant, reimbursement policies, all that sort of stuff. And the second methodology that we went through was more of a non-traditional means. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Yammer before, but it's almost like an internal Facebook. So it's an internal social collaboration tool. We use it internally at GE. And someone within GE had a bright idea to develop an EV-only Yammer group. So essentially invite all the drivers that are driving an EV to this group for them to communicate with one another. Within days, we found that this group had immense popularity, and people were just chatting in the group, asking questions, answering each other's questions. And so we found that the information kind of flowed through three buckets. One was real-time feedback, so drivers would post what's working, what's not working, general comments. And so I've just copied and pasted a blurb there on a driver that commented about how they were able to charge up at a hotel. And another driver, I think, responded to that and uploaded a map of charging stations that they had found. Drivers helping drivers, this is another big thing that we noticed. Essentially, a driver would post a question on the Yammer group, and before we even had a chance to respond to his question, another driver would respond to it. And so that was just phenomenal from a learning standpoint. And then encouraging competition. So this is something a little bit more playful, but a lot of drivers in the group were also posting how much range they were able to get from their vehicle, how many days they were able to go without getting fuel. And so as you can see here from the quote I put up there, only used 30 liters of fuel for 3,000 kilometers so far. And you would see a lot of drivers kind of encouraging competition there, which was great from an engagement perspective. So I've pulled some qualitative feedback on the vehicles, the charging stations, all that sort of good stuff from Yammer up on this page. I apologize because I know that the text is small. I tried to keep this as candid and transparent as possible, so rest assured there's no wordsmithing here. So I'm just going to kind of run through some of the challenges that we've faced in the program and some of the great components as well too. And I'm obviously not going to run through all of these just due to time, but with respect to battery performance, we have noticed through our drivers' feedback there are challenges in predicting battery behavior, so to speak, how much range they're going to get from their battery on a given day. A lot of it on our end is now going back to our drivers and providing education on better driving techniques so that they can maximize their range. With respect to space, there has been some challenges within space in the vehicle. As I mentioned, we have a lot of drivers that carry around big pieces of tool or equipment or products for their customers, and so that has been a little bit of a challenge, as well as drivers that have families with more than 4 individuals have found it challenging as well. With respect to charging, the drivers love the fact that we provided them with level 2 charging stations to be installed in their home. They love the fact that there's charging stations available on the campus, but at the same time, a lot of drivers are noticing that there's not a whole lot of infrastructure built out anywhere else, and I think that's a consensus in this room, not just with our drivers. But overall, with respect to their experience with the program, drivers have been so phenomenal in providing responses of this being the best company car they've ever had, the Volt being the best car they've ever driven, getting stopped by pedestrians on the road because they have questions about the Volt. And so overall, it's been very, very positive. So I've included some hard data on this slide. So as I mentioned, we have 1,000 vehicles on the road. In Q1, we had about 100, and then in Q4, we had about 500 total. And so as of Q4 11, we had about 162 vehicles that had enough information, so 2 to 10 months worth of fuel information that was sufficient for us to calculate some meaningful metrics. And so I've included these metrics on the slide here. We've compared, for the purposes of these calculations, we've compared the Chevy Volt to a Chevy Impala. That's simply because in the U.S., the Chevy Impala is our main vehicle in the fleet selector. It's either a Chevy Impala or a Chevy Impala. And so we decided to compare against that there. And so you can see that the savings have been tremendous so far, 140,000 fuel liters that have been saved, $165,000 of fuel expense savings, and that was based on average cost per liter of $1.16, and as we know, prices have just shot up since then, so that's probably even more significant at this point. With respect to driver reimbursement, so at this point, to be completely candid, it's fairly primitive. We provide our drivers with a stipend on a monthly basis, assuming 1 charge per business day every day in the month, and it's based on region. So if you're in the city of Toronto, you'll be paying a different electricity rate than in the province of Quebec. And so it is fairly primitive at this point. We do have the hopes with the next release of the Watt Station to have the ability to accurately track the charging costs associated with the program. I've included some of the rates that we'll be using for our Canadian drivers onto the right, so you can see that Quebec and Manitoba actually both have some of the cheapest electricity rates, and therefore there should be some more fuel savings there. Okay, so one of the other challenges that we're facing now as we begin to roll out electric vehicles in our Canadian fleet is with respect to taxable benefits. And so essentially taxable benefits in the way they work in Canada for a driver, they're based on the cap cost of the vehicle, and then there's something called personal use charges. Some of you may be aware, and as of this year, I believe it's about 26 cents per personal use kilometer. When you think about an electric vehicle, you're paying a premium for the actual cost of the vehicle, and so you kind of get hit on the cap cost part. And then with respect to the personal use charge, which is 26 cents, and that's based on things like fuel and maintenance and all that sort of stuff, that might not necessarily apply to EVs, you're hit there again too. So when we ran the math, and we looked back at our drivers that had logged their taxable benefit data from last year, we found that most drivers were driving around 25,000 kilometers per year, so kind of in that moderate range on that chart to the right. And of that, 15% of those kilometers were personal use. And so we found that comparing it to a Nissan Altima, which is another commonly found vehicle in our Canadian fleet selector, a driver would have to pay $193 out of pocket in taxable benefit. And so this is a challenge for us. We're figuring out a way to deal with this internally, whether it's making the drivers whole on the taxable benefit or stretching out the amort period. But that is a challenge that we're currently facing. With respect to volt enhancements, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. This was just asked at another conference we were at a couple of months back, and so I thought I'd include it in here. But essentially, as some of us may know, there was some challenges with the volt battery due to a fire that was caused in June of last year. Essentially, in November, during an HSTA investigation, GM offered loaner vehicles to any Volt owner. We sent out a communication to all of our drivers in our U.S. fleet to determine whether any of them wanted to exchange their vehicle for a loaner vehicle for temporarily. And we're glad to report that actually none of our drivers responded with a yes, I want another vehicle. All of them are extremely comfortable with their Volts, and they felt completely safe in them. So the GE impact now is that we're working with our drivers just to ensure that the vehicles are modified with the Volt enhancement. Okay, so I've talked quite a bit about our internal case study. What I want to spend a minute on right now is just talking about what we as the fleet services team can do to you through our learnings. And this is essentially our fleet sort of EV solution. So it's everything from ordering the vehicles and ordering the EVSE for our customers to helping them source an installer. We have a national installer in the US, and we're working on a national contract within Canada right now as well too. Financing the solution, including the charging stations, the vehicles, and the installation, and then also helping you navigate through the government incentives, and then tracking all the data that goes along with that. In Eden Prairie, Minnesota, where our fleet headquarters are located, we've recently opened up an Echo Experience Center that focuses on things like GE solar technology, EVs, charging stations, LED lighting, all that sort of good stuff. And right behind the center, NASCAR actually designed this beautiful test track for us for test driving EVs. We have a solar carport located there as well too, and we'll have some EVs that are permanently located there. So this is your formal invitation to all of you here today. If you're ever in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, I'm not sure why you would be, but if you are ever in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, this is your formal invitation. We'd love to have you at our center and to test drive the vehicles. And so without further ado, that's my presentation, and thank you all so much.